Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Down to Business. I've got Steve Meyn joining me today. Steve's the current managing partner of PKF in Sydney and Newcastle, and PKF Australia chairman, newly appointed. But I'm talking to Steve IT consulting today, and it's such a big part of business. And the reason we've got Steve here is he I guess, initially started the IT offering at PKF and has been a leading light in regards to setting up the current digital and IT strategies. So who better to talk to help, generally clients and business owners, but also learning from what they've done themselves in regards to their whole IT approach. So welcome, Steve.
Thanks, Andrew. Good to be here.
Mate, long intro there. I don't even know if I got it right, but you've been involved in IT consulting since about the mid-90s, I believe. So it feels like a long, long time ago now, but you've seen a fair bit of change. Let's talk to me about that journey and how it started and some of the change you've seen to now being here in 2021.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think if I go back to the mid-90s when I first got involved, I think it's fair to say that IT was almost seen as this separate thing in business. And, it was sort of the IT was over there and the business was here. And yeah, sure, little bits of the IT played their role in and around most businesses. But what you've seen develop over the last sort of 30 years nearly is IT has just become an ingrained part of business. And so all aspects of what you do day in, day out, IT has its place.
Well, it's nearly leading a lot of decisions, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a chicken and egg thing sometimes. Is the IT taking the business on the journey, or is the business taking the IT on the journey? And so that speed has just changed dramatically over that time, and the plethora of systems and therefore specialists and consultants has just grown enormously. So much so, as you see today, is those jobs are massively in demand, and people are getting paid exorbitant salaries for something that used to be sort of quite a mundane role in an organisation in IT.
I think it's interesting too that and I think right back to my dad's business, 80s, 90s, etc. before retiring, and it was always checkbook, even going to the bank, a lot of cash, but when we think about IT and what is IT and how far it reaches, I mean, I saw a busker the other week. I don't carry cash. Who carries cash anymore? And the busker had a tap. I'm like, geez, that's. But that is the extent of technology is touching so much of our lives that you can't put your head in the sand.
Oh, absolutely, and I think for the business owner, the biggest challenge is because it is such wide-reaching in all parts of the business and the speed at which it's changing and growing, it's a really hard thing to stay on top of. And equally, the question becomes, to what extent do I employ people in-house versus do I use a range of suppliers and partners that can help me through it?
So before we touch on that, I think for the uninitiated or the layman such as myself, we talk IT, and I just said about the breadth. How would you describe it? Can you break that down for me?
Yeah, look, I think there's probably a few sort of categories. If you talk the business owner,
from a business.
Yeah, so if you talk the business owner, I think first and foremost, you've got all of your sort of communication tools, and let's sort of talk about that in the context of your email system, your mobile phone and communications contracts. These days you're seeing things like vehicle tracking and all of that sort of becomes part of that communications aspect of IT and how it's enabled businesses in that space. I think secondly then, if you go to the core of systems and software, is you've got obviously the architecture and the systems that the business sits on, so it could be the network environment, whether that's in-house within the business or you're using a cloud-based network environment. Then you've got the software, which is, for most businesses, that's Could be an accounting system, could be an inventory control system, commonly termed as ERP, in the IT land. But it's those sort of tools that are specific to what that business functionality relates to. And then if you go to the broader end, IT we'd sort of bucket into the governance and risk aspect of IT. And that's very much around what have you got in place to protect the business, from things coming through from the internet, email scams, all the things that go with protecting the IT environment. And so you'd sort of bucket it into that, communication tools, systems and software solutions, and governance and risk, for me. And over the top sits across all of that would be, well, what's the business's IT plan or strategic IT plan for how they invest in and govern and manage all of that?
And obviously, as we said before, that yes, a chicken and egg, but that plan's got to also talk to the strategic plan or the objectives of the business, etc., and budget for that matter. Yeah,
look, and it's, and we've been guilty of it ourselves over the years. I think the challenge is that if you think about a business, everyone will come to you and go, you should have this in IT and you should have that. And as you get new people, they have their own little flavour of what they want in systems and software and all that. And so what you tend to find is most businesses don't come at the IT from a planning perspective, whether that be an implementation plan or a strategic plan. They tend to just get the systems or solutions. And then it's really interesting in some of the work we do where if we go in and do sort of an IT systems audit and then you start to unpack what sits on that environment, it's amazing how many times you'll sort of present the report and go to the owner, for example, you've got 32 systems, software systems, and they go, no, we only use 5 or 6. And it's all these bits that have accumulated over the years that just sit there dormant and or underutilised.
Well, I think one of the old terms we used to always refer to was it's not software, it's shelfware.
Yeah,
it's all good and sounds good in theory, but there's dollars and cents in everything. It needs to actually be considered. Okay, so that's a great start. Sorry, ERP. What's it stand for?
Enterprise Resource Plan.
Okay, just for us, just testing you. All right, so. I guess if there is so much, and as the example you just gave was great from we use 5, we've got 32, et cetera, and people are, because, as you said, it's becoming more prevalent, you're getting things thrown at you all the time. How do you help clients actually navigate and bring structure?
Look, I think the first step for any business one is really to understand what is it they actually need. And so what you tend to find is that clients will get a whole lot thrown at them and they read a lot and talk to their peers and those sort of things. The process that we would normally go through with a client is to really sit back and go, first and foremost, what is your business about? What is the critical part of what you do? Therefore, the things that you need to be worried about when all this stuff's coming at you is more what systems and or vendors are going to support you in helping deliver that strategic directional plan or wherever you want to go. So our process with that is very much to first sit with the stakeholder and understand where are they going, what are they trying to achieve with the business. And a strategic plan is a really good footprint for us to be able to do that off, because it sort of helps you understand where they want to go and then being able to decipher all of the noise around them and go, well, here's what's really critical to you from an IT perspective.
So, just again, be a bit more visual. Have you got a good example where you've worked with a business owner in that perspective?
Yeah, look, I think, one example that comes to mind is we worked with a hospitality client. They were quite a reasonable size hospitality client, had grown and developed a number of new parts of what they offered into the business. And really they had a whole lot of systems and solutions that they were paying for that were not talking to each other. So not only had they had a number of systems, as they'd grown, they just added more bodies because people were picking up data from this system and inputting it into this system that then was input into that system and so on. So the approach very much we took there was to sit back and go, well, look, where are you trying to go? Where do you want to go in terms of your business? And then basically what we did was drew a diagram of everything that they currently had in terms of systems and processes and how that was all working together. And then out of that highlighted and said, well, here's what you could take out. And whether that be a system or a process step that people were undertaking by narrowing it down to a couple of solutions that they needed. And I think what really shone out of that was that the system they had was actually very capable of delivering what they needed it to deliver. It was just that they were utilising about 35 to 40% of its capability. And then secondly, they'd allowed individuals to suggest what they now should buy and have, that no one had sat back in terms of looking at the overall plan to say, well, here's where that would fit in or not fit in most cases.
So, yeah, rather than give a holistic approach.
Yeah, and I'd have to say it's probably not something that many businesses do ever, which is to sit back and actually have a look at what they got and what could they utilise of that, versus they all get worried about going off and buying the next best thing.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, I've seen it in our own business, and I'm probably the worst offender, to be honest. You can have all the systems, but as you said, if you're not using it, and half the time that comes from lack of training or engagement, you're not going to get the benefits. So sometimes it's, I'm paying for the Rolls Royce, but, you know, I'm driving it like, you know, the family sedan.
Yep, see that all the time, you know, and it's a real challenge because back to what you said before is businesses get so much thrown at them around IT about you should have this, you should have that, this is the best, you know, da-da-da-da. How do they decipher through all that? Which is where working with someone like ourselves who can bring an independent view to that, to then go, well, here's what you really do based on where you want to go, and then using that to help manage what sort of investment they do make.
Yeah, look, I think that's the key word you just said, is independent. Like, in all honesty, if I'm acting for a vendor and I'm paid to sell product, well, of course I'm going to talk up my product and can say I can do everything. So, you know, it's that independence, I guess, the best way we describe it, to actually sit there and go, hey, hang on, what are you trying to achieve? And let's look at the facts.
Yeah. And I think, the other thing is obviously, even though you're independent, it's equally working very closely often with those vendors and partners and or their own internal IT team to actually get a right outcome. So it's not to say disregard everything you've got and done and your own team, but it's just sort of that helicopter view of being able to go, well, here's what you should have.
Well, on that point, I might just jump ahead. I'll come back to a couple of these other questions, but with that, because I mean, I know how you work. You're not in selling hardware. You're not in, you know, putting in systems, etc. You are doing that consulting. So there'll be a lot of, I imagine, other firms out there be sitting there going, hang on, you're taking my work, but you work very collaboratively. And I think a good analogy is that, you know, the GP and the specialist type thing. Talk to me a bit about how you work with partners, if you like, or maybe, you know, supply chain, if you like, to help business owners.
Yeah, look, probably a good example of that is when we go in and say our client's concerned about their current Meyn system, you know, their ERP that you're using for things like inventory control, accounting, customers, sales, all that sort of thing. What we would tend to do is, first and foremost, take a look at what that business actually needs, as I mentioned before. So that often will entail us just having a view of mapping out, you know, what do they do in their key processes and functionality and all that sort of thing. And then really our first port of call normally is to go back to the vendor of the solution that they've got to try and work with them to say, look, here's what the business needs. We know the system's either capable or not capable in these areas. How is it that you and we can work to get the business what they actually need? Now, if we go in on that exercise and work out that the business has outgrown their current system, which happens, you know, that's not uncommon, we then would normally go out to a number of vendors to say, look, here's what the business is after. We think your products are capable. can you sort of put forward a proposal and do a demo and all that sort of thing to help us get the client to select the right solution. So we will never sit there and implement the system ourselves. We work very collaboratively with the vendors, whether that be the software, the hardware, the communications vendors and so on. But really we're there to act on behalf of the client and make sure the client's getting the right outcome at the end of the day.
So sort of like a project lead.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. You mentioned before about, and we all see it. I mean, the pace. The pace is just increasing. I think if you did a graph of when you first started, way back when, the exponential growth in the last, say, 5 to 10 years would be just ridiculous. What do you see with regards to pace and options? And again, what's your approach to that?
Yeah, look, I think the pace is just thick and fast. If you look at from that time in the mid-90s, probably the period from then to 2010, has moved slower than the last 3 years, in terms of how quick technology is just coming at business and so on. And in that regard, for us, keeping abreast of that is a challenge in itself. So, and therefore you can imagine for a client, we're fortunate enough where we've been able to build some teams that are in different pockets of IT consulting, as we talked about before, whether that's ERP versus governance, risk versus communications, and those
or even from a data analytics point of view.
Data analytics, all that is that's allowed us to, one, be able to give a better chance at staying ahead of the game in that regard, but then two, being able to almost separate out what's relevant to what's a bit of noise out there. But I think if you look at where we sit here today, there is unquestionably the issue of data science and the power of data is what every business is sort of seeking to get and use and make better decisions. And you're seeing that with the vendors. I look at, even at a simplistic level, what the likes of Xero and that are doing in terms of presenting some form of data analytics into their product to assist businesses. And then you go to the very top end scale of the Oracles of the world and what they've done with their products to try and all present better data. To me, the power of data is just where that whole IT environment is heading, on one side of the equation.
Well, it's decision making, isn't it?
Yeah, and then on the other side of it is that connectivity piece. So you look at what the likes of Microsoft continue to do, and COVID's been a great example for us all to use things like Teams and Zooms and that of the world. It's the connectivity speed of IT is just allowing, whether it's mobile workforce or supplier customer interactions at a different level. It's the speed of that pace is just a real opportunity.
Well, and they're good examples of where I know from my own clients talking that previously had never considered pitching to a potential client via, Teams or Zoom or whatever it may be. When they're forced to, and the potential actually says, I preferred this, a lot more efficient. It's a good use of technology that, again, forced the hand a bit, but is now driving future ways of doing business. So, I think that's a cracking example.
And I think, mate, what it's also doing is it's driving efficiency. Like, we've seen it ourselves, and, you look at a whole raft of examples during COVID. I think genuinely meetings have become more efficient by virtue of the use of Teams. Not just alone the travel that people have saved and so on. And don't get me wrong, you can't beat sitting across the table from someone in certain meetings, but it has its place. And so, travel's reduced. I find meetings have become more efficient in their structure by virtue of the use of Teams and the like. So I just think that some of those benefits that we've now seen will continue to evolve into business.
Yep.
And you can see it in Microsoft and the like, where their investment in Teams and what it's capable of with automations and workflows and all those features that are being added. As I say, to me, the two big players will be the comms side and what you can do with it, and data power and what you can do with it is to me where that whole digitalisation.
Yeah, and in some ways they might start to sell themselves, but that's a perception. But for me, it's something they're going, what you're talking about, what you do is even more important. And no offence to any role or anyone, but like you've seen it with Apple. Every time they release the iPhone, they've got lines of people trying to get that next product. And anyone that's got a technology bent, I guess, is interested in that extra, little bolt-on or whatever it may be. But business owners really need someone sitting there going, hang on, what are you actually getting out of this? Because it's another upgrade, it's a business disruption. So realistically, we've got to be, for all the great improvements, sometimes you've got to weigh out that cost-benefit scenario.
Oh, very much so. And I think that the thing that I find when you sort of look at IT is that it's really easy to identify where you should spend and what you should spend it on. Most businesses struggle with, so what's the financial outcome going to be for me, and that doesn't necessarily always have to be dollars of revenue and the like, but, it could be time saving, like we just talked about with meeting efficiency and a recent client we've worked on out of here in Newcastle is what could it mean for things like order process efficiency and how
customer experience,
supplier direct connectivity, with you versus going through multiple channels and so on. So I think, people sitting back, and one of the things we do when working with clients is to go, well, if you're going to spend this money, let's identify the success factors that are going to be the measure of why you should spend this amount of money. And I just think that's a missing piece for most business owners in the way that they think about it. And they get, as I said before, they get pushed by employees or vendors to go, you should have this. But it's just taking that time to maybe sit back and go, yeah, maybe I should, but let's identify where I'm going to win out of this.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, you only know what you know.
Yeah.
And I think as you alluded to before, that years ago it used to be a thing, we have to have it, but we can get away with it. And now it's such an integral part of business. You need to have the right solution and therefore need to invest that time and maybe that relationship up front with the right people to get that result.
Yeah, and that's where, back to your comment on vendors, that's where your relationship with your vendors is really important. So one of the things that I think, and this is, any vendors watching, I think a lot of vendors leave money on the table. And what I mean by that is they sell the system and sign in a support agreement and move on, focus on the next sale. But the vendors that actually invest some time there maybe to catch up with the client a couple of times a year to see what's going on in their business and where they're thinking strategically and where they want to go, and then being able to say, well, here's how you can use our product to enable that or improve that or whatever. I just think there's a massive opportunity for vendors to work closer with customers. And so parts of the consulting that we've also done is in and around how do you bring that vendor and client relationship together so that they are genuinely working as a partner, and going together where they should take the system.
Really good point. So obviously the thing a lot of people are thinking around, they hear all the war stories and the horror stories around cyber security, and everyone down the pub's got a story of the business has just paid someone $2 million, whatever it may be. I think what is evident, and we can't deny, is with all of this information going into the cloud, into the ether, etc., obviously risk is elevated.
Yep.
And you've mentioned risk a few times now, but let's talk about that a bit more around what is the risk around risk, I guess, and what part or what approach should be looked at there.
Mate, I think it's it's the downside of the pace that we talked about with technology and how fast it's going is equally the risk is growing at an exponential rate because of all of that as well. And so I think sometimes as we all sort of see the articles on scams and phishing and all those sort of things, but inherently if you look at the stats, most issues of risk occur from within. And so I think most businesses will tend to do reasonably well things like having a firewall to protect from the internet coming through, the sort of bits and pieces that you can add in and around your system. But the things that often get missed are the real simple things. And so things like keeping patches and updates on your servers and that up to speed, educating your team on don't open these emails. And so I actually think there's a real opportunity in a lot of the sort of work we do when we go in and do a risk assessment and an IT audit is often it's the non-dollar cost things that you can do that can actually be a big difference to the risk of cyber and the like. And I think the other thing for business owners to appreciate is, you know, something like cyber is probably not a question of if it happens to me, but it's when will it happen to me. And so the earlier that you can sort of start to get a real good, strong governance approach to that from both within your team and then outside, e.g. firewalls and the like, that's a real critical pathway for business owners today to give themselves every chance to protect, as equally as looking at things like your insurance policies and all those that sit around all that.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, I guess, and you've got to be careful with this statement, but a lot of free information on these topics. I know you put a lot of communications out. I mean, obviously, if you don't know a lot about it, like, again, myself, well, you're going to read it. What do you take as gospel and what do you don't? But there's enough out there that you can start to, as you say, put some of these practices in place that aren't related to the specific system, but more the behaviours.
Yeah, absolutely, you know. And I think as directors, and, you know, we've all seen it, is the regulators are getting tougher on a director responsibility around protecting data. And so, you know, some of these things, as you say, are real simple things that might make a difference that actually are quite quick and cost effective to implement. Whilst you're still working with your vendor partners on all those other bits and pieces that need to sit out there as well. But I think there's a real opportunity in that for business owners to not sort of ignore it and go, oh, that only happens to the big end of town because we ain't got data that's really that important to them. Well, there's plenty of examples where the smaller people have been taken advantage of.
Yeah, and I think I hadn't even had that down as a point. I'm glad you raised that. What is a business owner's, I guess, obligations that they need to comply with from a point of view of privacy and data breaches and that sort of stuff? I mean, you could talk about that in a whole video on its own, right?
Yeah. You know, and it's, as I say, they're the things that are just going to continue to increase in terms of, you know, what you need to be doing in terms of trying to prevent it coming at you. So, but governance and risk, you know, it's as these days is a bigger bucket of investment for a business owner in IT as he was buying an ERP system or buying the laptop and service solutions.
Very good point.
You know,
very good point. So I guess start to bring this to a real action, if you like, a call to action. What should a business owner or a potential client, you know, et cetera, what should they do around their IT plan and approach? As probably a first step and then an ongoing approach.
I think there's a couple of really easy, quick things that all owners should do. I just talked about that notion of taking stock from a governance and risk perspective of, well, what have we got in place around those areas like password cycles, you know, education of our team, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, you know, that concept of a mini IT audit that just takes stock is a first and foremost thing. What will come out of that probably leads into part two, which is that will also give you a really good feel for what systems and solutions do I actually have versus what am I actually using. That helps you either switch off certain products that you maybe are still paying for, and or where am I not using some solutions that could actually enhance and enable a business.
And I think just on that point, you know, a lot of business owners probably sit there and go, geez, how do I even know that? Go to your bank account or your credit card statement. You know, most of them have gone to subscription-based now, so you'll see. It's kind of scary when you see how much you're actually paying out.
Yeah, and it's a bit like, you know, the home Netflix and Stan and all that. Once people switch them on, they often forget to switch them off. You know, so I think step one is sort of that, take stock of what you got and what are you using and not using. Step two is to really, we talked about the concept of most people use about 35 to 40% of the capability of their ERP/financial systems, is really to look at what is that system capable of that I'm not using or that I could be using better that can help drive some efficiencies into the business? And if you think about that process, that'll identify one of two outcomes. One is, yeah, you're right, we could be using more of this and it will help us. Or two is, maybe we've outgrown this system. What else is out there that I can be looking at? And then I think step 3 is then, which is more sort of the medium to longer term, is pulling out your business strategic plan and saying, well, what does this mean for how IT could enable or enhance what I'm trying to achieve? And then using that to put together a bit of an IT plan of investment for the future and where I might take it. So they'd be sort of the top 3 things that I think you can do, and overriding out of all that will therefore come, I'm doing a bit of the risk and governance aspect of it, I'm doing a bit of the strategic aspect of it, and I'm driving some efficiencies into my business.
Yeah, and I think, on those 3 points ongoing, it's not a set and forget. I mean, I don't think you have to be addressing it as the business owner every month, but, there needs to be periodic and regular approach to this to look and say, well, because of that pace, have we got what we need to deliver? Are there more efficient ways, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, and I guess the challenge for the SME land is that when you get to sort of larger end businesses or businesses governed by regulators, is usually the audit assurance framework takes care of some of that because it gets built into whether the external auditor's doing their bit or an internal audit program. The challenge for the SME land is that you don't necessarily have that forces you to do it every year or every couple of years. And so I just think it's a part of, as equally as you invest in other resources like plant and equipment and people, where you're looking at maintenance and preventative maintenance and performance and all that sort of thing, given IT is such a massive part of what you invest in these days, why should you treat that any differently? And so build it into your framework.
Yeah, it's absolutely, and a great point. I've seen that sitting on a lot of advisory boards or boards for that matter, and years ago it used to be the thing on the end of the agenda that we'd get to, and now it's probably front and centre, and it's a lot of decisions are based off that. So.
Yeah. And the only other point I'd add on that too, Andrew, would be I think the nature of sort of the people that you're working with and recruiting is changing by virtue of technology. So, as we've seen here, is businesses may be starting to invest in people like data analysts, invest in partnerships with vendors that can help supply that information for them and the like.
And if you've got areas where labour may be a bit short, they don't need to be sitting there because of your technology.
Absolutely, yep. So I think it's just sort of looking at your business in a bit of a broader context to go, well, maybe these are the sort of resources and arrangements I need to have in place that can help drive the use of IT better in the business.
Yeah, so I think a fair summary on that would be, going back to your first point, what's our strategy or what are we trying to achieve or solve?
Yep.
And working backwards to see how technology plays the part.
Yep.
But then also how we don't then use that technology to bring our business down, if you like.
Correct.
Mate, look, again, massive topic,
huge.
And I'm sure, but for the business owners out there, I think Steve just put a good summary together. He's bucketed into the three areas around systems, comms, and risk and governance. But more importantly, you don't know what you don't know. You don't need to be an expert in all of this. Having an independent view to actually help you, what are you trying to achieve, rather than just listen to the sales spiel, and don't get too excited. A great approach that you probably need to look at and do it pretty regularly for your business.
Yep.
Well, anything to add?
No, look, as I said, the only thing I'd say is it's such a big part of our lives these days that to not, as a business owner, look at it and have an understanding of what's going on around it in your business, I think you sort of do yourself a disservice to what you can do in regards to where you take technology as part of your business strategy.
You can't put your head in the sand.
Can't put your head in the sand.
Thanks, Steve, for joining me.
Thanks, Andrew. Enjoyed.
Until next time, cheers.